The brutal murder of 19-year-old Jason Miller shook the quiet suburban neighborhood to its very core. What appeared at first to be a tragic accident soon unraveled into a dark and twisted tale of forbidden love, betrayal, and cold-blooded murder. At the center of this horrifying story was the secret and illicit affair between Jason and his married neighbor, Linda Hargrove. It all started on a warm summer evening when Linda Hangrove, a 51-year-old housewife, stood in the kitchen, her hands mindlessly washing dishes as her husband Richard sat in the living room, absorbed in the evening news. Their marriage, once full of passion, had long since settled into a comfortable routine. The excitement of their early years had been replaced with the monotony of daily life, leaving Linda feeling invisible and unfulfilled. It was during these quiet moments, when the house was still and the world outside seemed distant, that Linda's thoughts began to drift. They often lingered on Jason, the boy next door. She had watched him grow up, seen him playing in the yard as a child, but recently she had begun to notice him in a different light. He was tall and athletic, with a youthful charm that made her pulse quicken in a way she hadn't felt in years. Their interactions started innocently enough, Jason helping her carry groceries and mowing the lawn when Richard was too busy. They would exchange pleasantries, his easy smile always making her heart flutter. But over time, those brief encounters began to linger in her mind long after they ended. She found herself looking for excuses to see him, her thoughts consumed by his image. One evening, as she was taking out the trash, Linda saw Jason sitting on his front porch, a book in his hands. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them faded away. Linda felt a strange thrill, a rush of excitement that made her feel alive. Before she knew it, she was crossing the lawn, drawn to him by a force she couldn't resist. "What are you reading?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual, though her heart pounded in her chest. Jason looked up, smiling. "Just something for school," he said, showing her the book. "You like reading?" "I used to," Linda replied, shrugging. "I don't have much time for it these days." "Maybe you should make time," Jason suggested, his eyes holding hers for a moment too long. "It might be a nice escape." His words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Linda felt a blush creeping up her neck, but she quickly dismissed it. She wasn't some silly schoolgirl with a crush. She was a grown woman, a wife, and a mother. Yet there was something about Jason that she couldn't shake, a pull that she found herself drawn to, despite knowing it was wrong. As the days passed, their conversations grew longer and the space between them grew smaller. Jason started stopping by more often, sometimes under the pretense of needing help with schoolwork, and other times just to chat. Linda knew she should put an end to it before it went too far, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. One afternoon, with Richard away on a business trip and her son at school, Jason knocked on her door. Linda opened it, her heart leaping at the sight of him standing there. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice soft, almost hesitant. Linda hesitated, but then stepped aside, allowing him to enter. They sat together in the living room, the air between them thick with tension. Jason looked around, searching for something to say, but when his gaze settled on her, all words seemed unnecessary. "I can't stop thinking about you," he finally confessed, his voice low. Linda's breath caught in her throat. This was the moment she had both feared and longed for. She knew she should stop him, tell him this was wrong, that it had to end. But instead, she found herself leaning closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "I think about you too," she whispered. And with that, the dam broke. Jason kissed her, his hands pulling her close as they tumbled onto the couch. Linda's mind screamed at her to stop, to push him away, but her body betrayed her, responding to his touch with a hunger she hadn't known existed within her. Hours later, as the afternoon light faded into dusk, they lay tangled together on the couch, their breathing heavy, the reality of what they had done settling in. Linda stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal. As Jason dressed and prepared to leave, he leaned down and kissed her softly on the lips. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, his voice filled with promise. Linda nodded, unable to find the words to respond. As the door closed behind him, a wave of emotion crashed over her. Guilt, excitement, fear, and something else she couldn't quite name. It was the beginning of something dangerous, something she knew could destroy everything if it ever came to light. But for the first time in a long time, Linda felt alive, and she wasn't ready to let go of that feeling just yet. The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and secret rendezvous. Linda and Jason met whenever they could, their affair growing more intense with each passing day. They knew the risks, but the pull between them was too strong to resist. Linda found herself lying more and more. But then things started to change. Jason started to act different, small things at first. He would get jealous if she mentioned Richard or if she couldn't see him because of her family. He would text her constantly, demanding to know where she was and what she was doing. At first, Linda dismissed it as youthful insecurity, but as his behavior grew more erratic, a sense of unease began to creep in. And still, she couldn't bring herself to end it. The excitement, the danger, it was all too intoxicating. But deep down, she knew it couldn't last. Something had to give. It was only a matter of time before consequences would catch up with her, and it was only becoming worse and worse. Jason's behavior was becoming more erratic and more obsessive, and it scared Linda. But fear was quickly overshadowed by the excitement and thrill that still coursed through her every time they were together. She told herself that she could handle it, that she had everything under control. After all, wasn't she the one who held all the power in this situation? But the illusion of control was just that, an illusion. It wasn't long before Jason's obsession with Linda began to manifest in more troubling ways. He would show up at her house unannounced, sometimes late at night, his eyes wild with a desperation that sent chills down her spine. He started leaving small gifts for her, flowers, jewelry, and once a poem scrawled on a piece of notebook paper, the words almost incoherent in their intensity. "You don't have to do this, Jason," Linda said one afternoon when he showed up with a bracelet, his fingers trembling as he handed it to her. "This is what we're doing. It needs to stay low-key. We can't draw attention to ourselves." But Jason didn't seem to hear her. He just stared at her with those intense eyes, his voice cracking as he spoke. "I can't lose you, Linda. You're the only thing that makes sense in my life." His words should have been flattering, but instead, they felt like a noose tightening around her neck. She tried to reassure him, telling herself that he was just young, that this was just a phase, but the gnawing sense of dread was becoming impossible to ignore. One evening, after another heated argument with Richard over some trivial matter, Linda found herself driving to a secluded spot by the lake where she and Jason often met. The sun had long since set, and the night was dark, with only the faint glow of the moon illuminating the water. She parked the car and got out, the cool breeze ruffling her hair as she waited for him. Jason arrived minutes later, his bike skidding to a stop beside hers. He smashed the bike to the ground and stalked over to where Linda was standing. The look on his face was one she hadn't seen before. Something darker, more dangerous. "What's wrong?" she asked, her heart pounding as he approached. "Why are you still with him?" Jason demanded, his voice low and menacing. "Why do you keep going back to him when you know he doesn't love you like I do?" Linda took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. "Jason, we've talked about this. You know I can't just leave him. It's complicated." "It's not complicated," Jason cut her off, his voice rising. "It's simple. You either love me or you don't. If you do, then leave him. If you don't..." He trailed off, his expression hardening. Linda's mind raced as she tried to calm him down. "Jason, please. You're scaring me. I love you. But this isn't the way. You don't love me," Jason shouted, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "If you did, you'd be with me, not him." The intensity of his emotions was overwhelming, and for the first time Linda truly felt the danger of the situation. She tried to reach out, to place a comforting hand on his arm, but he jerked away, his eyes flashing with anger. "I don't want to play games anymore, Linda," Jason hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You have to choose. It's me or him." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Linda stared at him, her heart racing as she tried to find the right words. But before she could speak, Jason grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip almost painful. "You're mine," he growled, his face inches from hers. "You belong to me, not him, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep you." The look in his eyes was terrifying, a mixture of love and madness that sent chills down Linda's spine. She knew she had to get out of there, had to end this before it went too far, but Jason wasn't giving her a choice. He was spiraling, and she was being pulled down with him. But there was more. Over the next few days, Jason's behavior grew even more weird. He would call her at all hours, demanding to know where she was and who she was with. He began showing up at her house when Richard was home, lurking outside, watching them. Linda tried to confront him, to tell him that it had to stop. But every time she saw him, the desperation in his eyes left her speechless. And then, one night it happened. Linda was home alone, Richard away on another business trip. She was trying to relax, to forget about Jason and the mess she'd gotten herself into when she heard a noise outside. Her heart leaped into her throat as she crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. Jason was standing in the yard, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the porch light. He was staring up at her, his expression unreadable, his body tense as if ready to spring. Linda's first instinct was to call the police, but she hesitated, knowing that would only make things worse. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, her hands trembling. "Jason, what are you doing here?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "I had to see you," he replied, his voice eerily calm. "I've been thinking a lot and I know what I have to do." Linda's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back, the sense of danger overwhelming. "Jason, please, just go home. We'll talk tomorrow." But Jason didn't move. He just stood there, staring at her with those intense eyes, a small smile playing on his lips. "I know what I have to do," he repeated, his voice soft. Before Linda could react, Jason lunged at her, grabbing her arms and pulling her close. His grip was like a vice, and she could feel the raw strength in his hands as he held her. Panic surged through her as she struggled to break free, but he was too strong. "Jason, stop!" she cried, her voice shaking. "You're hurting me!" But Jason didn't seem to hear her. His eyes were wild, filled with a crazed determination that terrified her. "I'm doing this for us, Linda," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "You'll see. Everything will be okay once he's gone." Linda's blood ran cold as his words sank in. "What are you talking about?" she gasped, her fear turning to horror. Jason's smile widened and he loosened his grip just enough for her to pull away. "I'm gonna make it right," he said, his voice disturbingly calm. "I'm gonna get rid of him. Then we can be together." The realization of what he meant hit Linda like a truck. Jason was planning to kill Richard. The thought sent a wave of nausea through her and she stumbled back. She had to stop him, had to find a way to prevent the unthinkable. As Linda desperately tried to reason with Jason, to convince him that this wasn't the answer, she realized that the situation was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Jason's obsession had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. The magnitude of her mistakes came crashing down on her. This wasn't a game anymore. It was real and someone was going to die if she didn't do something. The night Jason revealed his deadly plan, Linda knew she had to act fast. She couldn't go to the police. They would ask too many questions. Questions that would lead to the unraveling of her entire life. She couldn't confront Richard either. He'd never understand how things had gotten this far. No, she had to handle this on her own. But how? The next day, Linda told Jason they needed to talk. She suggested they meet at their usual spot by the lake, hoping that the familiar setting would help her calm him down, to steer him away from the dangerous path he was on. As she drove to the lake, her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her thoughts racing. She had no idea what she was going to say to him, but she knew she had to find a way to stop him. Somehow. Jason was already there when she arrived, sitting on the edge, staring out at the water. His expression was calm, almost serene. This is how she went. "Jason," she called out softly, walking toward him. "We need to talk." He looked up at her, his face softening as he saw her approach. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice low. "I know you're scared, but you don't have to be. I'm going to take care of everything." Linda shook her head, trying to keep her voice steady. "No, Jason, you don't understand. This isn't the way. You can't just—" But before she could finish, Jason stood up and took her hands in his. "I love you, Linda. More than anything. I'm doing this for us so we can be together, don't you see? It's the only way." Linda felt the world closing in around her, the walls of her life crumbling as she stood there, holding hands with the boy who was about to destroy everything. She knew there was no reasoning with him, no talking him out of this madness. His mind was made up, and nothing she said would change that. Desperation fueled Linda's next move. She couldn't let Jason go through with this. She had to stop him, whatever the cost. "Jason," she said, her voice trembling as she forced a smile. "Let's just sit down for a minute, okay? We can figure this out together." He hesitated, his gaze flickering with uncertainty, but eventually he nodded and followed her to the edge of the lake. The air was thick with tension, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. As they sat by the water, Jason began to speak again. "I've thought about this a lot, you know, about how we could be together, without anyone getting in the way. It's not fair that he gets to have you all to himself when he doesn't even appreciate you. But I do, Linda. I love you." The words twisted in Linda's heart like a knife. She had wanted love, yes, but not like this. With a deep breath, Linda reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the handle of the knife. She knew what she had to do, even if it meant betraying the boy who had come to mean so much to her. This was her only chance to save Richard, to save herself, and to put an end to this nightmare. But before she could act, Jason's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the tense silence. He pulled it out and frowned at the screen. At that moment, Linda saw her opportunity. As Jason was distracted by the phone, she pulled the knife from her pocket, her hand trembling as she held it behind her back. Her mind raced, searching for the courage to do what needed to be done, but the hesitation cost her. Jason suddenly turned back to her, his eyes narrowing as he saw the fear in her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. Linda's heart skipped at a beat, but she forced herself to smile. "Nothing," she lied. "I just want this to be over, Jason. I want us to be together, like you said." But Jason wasn't fooled. He saw the truth in her eyes, the fear, the desperation. His gaze dropped to her hand, still hidden behind her back, and realization dawned on his face. "What are you hiding, Linda?" he demanded, his voice hardening. Linda's breath caught in her throat as she realized she had no more time. She had to act, and she had to act now. With a surge of adrenaline, she lunged forward, bringing the knife up, but Jason was quicker. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully as the knife fell from her grasp and landed with a soft thud on the grass. The next moments were a blur. Jason's grip on her wrist was like iron as he forced her to the ground, his face twisted in anger and betrayal. "I thought you loved me," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I'm doing this for us. How could you try to—" But before he could finish, Linda's knee jerked up, striking him in the groin with all the force she could muster. Jason doubled over in pain, his grip loosening just enough for Linda to scramble to her feet. She grabbed the knife and ran, her heart pounding in her ears as she sprinted toward the car. Jason recovered quickly, and before Linda could reach the car, he was on her again, tackling her to the ground. The knife flew from her hand, landing out of reach as they struggled on the cold, hard earth. Jason's strength was overpowering, and Linda felt herself slipping, her energy waning as his hands closed around her throat. "You're mine," Jason snarled, his face inches from hers. "If I can't have you, no one will." In a last desperate effort, Linda's hand found a large rock on the ground beside her. With every ounce of strength she had left, she brought it up and smashed it against Jason's head. The impact was sickening, and Jason's body went limp, his grip on her throat loosening as he slumped to the side. She scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking as she stared down at him, the rock still clutched in her hand. Blood pooled beneath his head, soaking into the earth, and she knew he was dead. The reality of what she had done crashed over her, and Linda fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. She had wanted to stop him, to save her husband, but in the end, she had taken a life. Jason, the boy she had once loved, was gone, and it was her doing. Hours passed before Linda could bring herself to move. When she finally did, she knew what she had to do. She couldn't let anyone find out what had happened here. She had to hide the evidence and cover her tracks. She dragged Jason's body to the edge of the lake. With trembling hands, she pushed him into the water, watching as his body sank beneath the surface, disappearing into the darkness. Linda cleaned the scene as best she could, hiding the knife and the blood-stained rock before driving home in a daze. She went about her life as if nothing had happened, forcing herself to smile, to act normal, all the while knowing that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She waited for the news of Jason's disappearance to break, for the police to come knocking at her door, but the days passed in silence. The lake, it seemed, had swallowed her secret whole. But the story didn't end there. Weeks later, Jason's body washed up on the shore, unrecognizable, decomposed by the water. The authorities deemed it an accidental drowning, a tragic end to a young life. No one suspected the truth, and Linda's secret remained buried beneath the weight of her guilt. Linda tried to push the memories away, to bury them as deeply as she had buried Jason, but they refused to stay hidden. They haunted her in her sleep, twisted her dreams into grotesque reminders of what she had done. She began to withdraw from everyone around her, Richard, her son, and even her friends in the neighborhood. They noticed the change in her, the way she seemed distant and distracted, but no one knew the truth. Linda's mind began to unravel. She started seeing Jason everywhere, in the reflection of a window, in the shadowy corners of her bedroom, even in the faces of strangers. At first, she thought it was just her guilt playing tricks on her, but soon the visions became more frequent and more vivid. She heard his voice whispering in her ear and felt his cold fingers brush against her skin when she was alone. She couldn't escape him, no matter how hard she tried. She became convinced that Jason was haunting her, that his spirit was seeking revenge for what she had done. The thought consumed her, driving her to the brink of madness. She stopped sleeping, too afraid of the nightmares that awaited her when she closed her eyes. She stopped eating, her appetite replaced by a constant knot of anxiety in her stomach. She was wasting away, both physically and mentally, and there was no one she could turn to for help. How could she confess what she had done? One night, unable to bear the torment any longer, Linda decided to return to the lake. It was the place where everything had started, and she felt an irresistible pull to go back as if the water held the answers to her suffering. She left the house in the dead of night, driving through the silent streets with trembling hands. The lake was eerily still when she arrived, the water a black mirror reflecting the dark sky above. Linda stood at the water's edge, staring out at the place where she had pushed Jason's body into the depths. The memories flooded back, overwhelming her with a tidal wave of guilt and grief. She dropped to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, her cries echoing across the empty landscape. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice choking with tears. "I'm so sorry, Jason." But there was no answer, only the cold, indifferent silence of the night. And then, as if driven by an unseen force, Linda waded deeper into the lake. The water rose higher, first to her waist, then to her chest, until it was all around her, cold and unforgiving. She didn't stop, didn't hesitate, as she walked further into the dark abyss. The water covered her shoulders, then her neck, and finally, her head. She didn't struggle, didn't fight. She let the water take her, let it pull her down into the depths where Jason's body had once lain. And for the first time in months, Linda felt a sense of relief. The next morning, Richard woke to find the house empty. Linda's car was gone, and her side of the bed was cold. He searched the house, growing more frantic with each passing moment, but she was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as he called the police, reporting his wife missing. The search began immediately, but no one knew where Linda had gone or why she had left in the middle of the night. Days passed, and still there was no sign of her. The neighbors whispered behind closed doors, speculating about what might have happened, but no one knew the truth. But eventually, the lake gave up. Linda's body was found a week later, floating near the shore where Jason's body had been discovered. The authorities ruled it a suicide, a tragic end to a troubled woman. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, leaving everyone in shock. Richard was devastated, his grief compounded by the mystery of what had driven his wife to such a desperate act. And so, the story comes to a close. The story of Linda Hargrove and Jason Miller faded into memory. But for those who knew the truth, the memory would never fade, and the guilt would never fully dissipate.